Elena Marsh gripped the edge of the podium as the chamber lights dimmed around her. Above her, hundreds of alien delegates leaned forward in their seats, waiting for her to break. The vote had already happened. Earth had already lost. And yet, for the first time in 20 years of standing in that room, Elena did not feel like losing. The Galactic Council chamber was a vast dome of shifting light, built from a crystal that changed color depending on the mood of the room. Right now it glowed a pale, mocking gold, the color the system used when it sensed a smaller power had just been outvoted by a larger one. Elena had seen that color too many times. She hated it more than she had ever admitted, even to herself. Beside her, on the human delegation bench, sat General Daniel Cross, arms folded, jaw tight. He had flown 12 hours from Earth for this session, only to watch a system his engineers had spent 9 years terraforming get handed to another species because of a claim so old that even the historians of the Council argued about whether it was real. The Vos Dominion delegate, a tall being named Threll with silver skin and eyes like polished stone, rose from his seat. He did not look at Elena. He never did. To him, and to most of the Council, humans were still the newest arrivals, still the loud, stubborn species that kept asking for more than they had earned. The system of Calder's Reach belongs, by ancient right, to the Vos Dominion, Threll said, his voice smooth and unhurried, as if he were reading a menu rather than taking away 9 years of human labor. Earth's presence there was always temporary. We thank them for their maintenance of the territory. A ripple of soft laughter passed through parts of the chamber. Not loud laughter, not cruel, exactly. Just the quiet, comfortable amusement of species who had never once had to fight for a place at this table. Elena felt her hands tighten on the podium's edge. She thought of Nathan Ford, the lead engineer on Calder's Reach, who had sent her a message only that morning, describing the first crops finally growing on soil that had been lifeless red dust when humans arrived. She thought of the 200 families who had already signed up to move there once the terraforming was complete. She thought of every session like this one, going back years, where Earth's delegation had swallowed its pride and accepted whatever scraps the older species allowed. She opened her mouth to speak the words she always spoke. We respectfully request a review. We ask the Council to reconsider. We hope for fair treatment in future sessions. But the words did not come. Instead, she looked up at the Golden Dome, at the rows of delegates who had already moved on to the next item on their agenda, already forgetting that an entire human colony had just been erased from a legal document with a flick of a hand. No, Elena said. The word was quiet, but the chamber's acoustics carried it to every corner of the dome. The golden light flickered, as if surprised. Council Speaker Voren Kahl, an old being with 4 eyes and a voice that usually carried the calm boredom of someone who had presided over this chamber for 300 years, turned toward her. Ambassador Marsh, the vote has concluded. There is a formal process for appeals, which your delegation is welcome to. I'm not appealing, Elena said. She stepped out from behind the podium, something no human ambassador had done in the history of Earth's membership in this council. Protocol required delegates to remain behind the podium unless invited forward. She ignored it. I'm telling you that this is the last time you will do this to us. The laughter stopped. Threll's stone eyes finally settled on her, sharp with something between confusion and irritation. Ambassador, your tone is... My tone is exactly what it should have been years ago, Elena said. Her voice did not shake. She had rehearsed calm words 1,000 times in her career, and now, in the moment that mattered most, she found she did not need to rehearse at all. The truth simply came out of her, plain and steady. Humanity has sat in this chamber for 2 decades. We have followed every rule you wrote before we arrived, rules we had no part in making. We have handed over resources, shared our discoveries, and asked for almost nothing in return, because we were told that patience was the price of respect. We paid that price every single time. She turned slowly, taking in the full circle of the chamber, letting her gaze pass over delegates from a dozen worlds she had spent years trying to please. And every single time, patience bought us nothing, she continued. You have taken our systems, you have dismissed our fleet as harmless, you have called our culture primitive in rooms where you thought we couldn't hear you, and in rooms where you knew we could. We kept asking, because we believed that if we behaved well enough, Eventually you would let us in. Elena paused. In the silence, she could hear General Cross shift in his seat behind her, could feel Laura Bishop, the intelligence officer seated 2 rows back, go very still. We were wrong to believe that, Elena said. And today, humanity stops asking. The chamber erupted into a storm of overlapping voices. Some delegates demanded order, others murmured urgently to their aides. Threll's silver face had gone rigid with something that looked almost like alarm, though he quickly smoothed it into practiced calm. Speaker Vorenkal raised a hand, and the ancient mechanisms of the chamber dimmed the noise automatically, restoring a fragile quiet. Ambassador Marsh, I must remind you that threats made in this chamber are recorded and may be used to justify sanctions against your species. This isn't a threat, Elena said. It's a fact. You have spent 20 years deciding what humanity is allowed to have. From this moment forward, we decide that for ourselves. She stepped back from the center of the floor, back toward her delegation bench, and for the first time in years, she felt something other than tired frustration settle into her chest. It felt almost like relief. The mask of patient diplomacy she had worn for 2 decades had finally cracked, and underneath it was something the Council had never expected to find in a human ambassador: certainty. General Cross leaned toward her as she sat down, his voice low. You just changed everything in about 90 seconds. I know, Elena said. Do you have a plan to back that up? Elena allowed herself the smallest smile, the first genuine one she had shown in that chamber in years. We've had one for longer than you think. Across the chamber, the delegates continued to argue amongst themselves, some outraged, some intrigued, a few oddly silent, watching the human delegation with expressions that were harder to read than usual. Threll sat back down slowly, his stone eyes narrowed, clearly recalculating something in his mind. What none of them knew, what none of them could have guessed from a single outburst in a crowded chamber, was that humanity's decision to stop asking had not been made that day. It had been made years earlier, quietly, carefully, far from any council session, in rooms with no cameras and no alien observers. Elena Marsh had simply been the one chosen to say it out loud. As the session finally adjourned and delegates filed out of the Great Golden Dome, murmuring about the strange behavior of the human ambassador, Elena walked beside General Cross through the long crystal corridor that led back to the human embassy wing. Neither of them spoke until they were well away from any listening device the Council might have planted. They'll think it was an emotional outburst, Cross said quietly. A moment of frustration, nothing more. Let them think that, Elena said. It buys us time. Time for what, exactly? You know the fleet isn't ready to challenge anyone directly. Not yet. Elena stopped walking and turned to face him. Behind her, through a tall window of curved glass, she could see the distant lights of a dozen alien starships docked at the Council's orbital platform, sleek and ancient, and impossibly advanced compared to anything humanity had built only a generation ago. It's not about being ready to challenge them today, she said. It's about making sure that the next time they try to take something from us, they understand there will be a cost. A real one, not a strongly worded letter, not a formal appeal that goes nowhere. A cost they can feel. Cross studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Laura's already moving. She started the moment you said the word no. Elena allowed herself a breath, the tension in her shoulders finally easing just slightly. Good, because Calder's Reach was never really about Calder's Reach. It was the last test. The Council needed to know exactly how far they could push us before we pushed back. And now they know. Now they know, Elena agreed. The only question left is whether they believe it. Far below, in a section of the embassy no alien delegate had ever been permitted to enter, Laura Bishop was already gathering a small, trusted team around a secure table, pulling up files that had been sealed for years. Peter Lang, the lead scientist on humanity's most closely guarded research project, was already answering his encrypted comm, his voice tight with a mixture of nerves and something close to excitement. The Council believed it had simply witnessed an ambassador lose her patience in a moment of frustration, the kind of small human drama that made for amusing gossip in the corridors afterward. They had no idea that they had just watched the opening move of something far larger, something that had been building quietly for years, waiting only for the right spark. Elena Marsh had given them that spark, standing alone in the center of their golden chamber, refusing for the first time to ask permission for anything at all. Behind her calm expression, as she finally reached the embassy's private wing and allowed the heavy doors to seal shut, Elena let out a long breath she had been holding for what felt like 20 years. Whatever came next, there would be no going back to quiet requests and patient appeals. Humanity had crossed the line today, in front of the entire galaxy, and there was only one direction left to move: forward. 3 levels beneath the embassy, in a room lit only by the soft blue glow of holographic displays, Laura Bishop stood at the center of a table covered in floating star charts. She had not slept in almost a day, but her mind felt sharper than it had in months. For years she had prepared for a moment that might never come. Now that it had arrived, she intended to waste none of it. Around the table stood a small circle of people she trusted completely, each of them chosen not for rank or title, but for discretion. Peter Lang stood closest to her, his sleeves rolled up, a nervous habit of tapping his fingers against his forearm, betraying the calm expression on his face. Beside him was Nathan Ford, freshly returned from Calder's Reach, still wearing the dust of that colony on his boots, his expression somewhere between grief for the world he had just lost and anger that made his jaw tight. "Ambassador Marsh gave us an opening," Laura said, her voice low and even. "The Council believes what happened today was emotion, a moment of weakness. That belief is worth more to us than any weapon we could build. We need to make sure it lasts as long as possible." "How long do we actually need?" Nathan asked. 18 months, if everything goes exactly as planned," Peter said. "Which it won't, so let's say 2 years, and hope we're wrong in the good direction instead of the bad one." Laura nodded and gestured, and the star charts above the table shifted, replaced by rows of technical schematics, ship hulls, engine cores, weapon arrays. Some of it was human design, refined over the past decade in secret shipyards, hidden along the edges of Earth's territory, far from any Council inspector's eye. Some of it was something else entirely, technology reverse-engineered from a single damaged alien vessel that had crashed in the outer reaches of human space nearly 15 years earlier, an incident the Council had never fully investigated, assuming the wreckage had been destroyed as required by treaty. It had not been destroyed, it had been studied, piece by piece, in complete secrecy, by a small and growing division of engineers who had spent their entire careers pretending to work on far less interesting projects. "The engine cores are stable now," Peter said, pulling up a diagram of a compact reactor unglamorous, flowing with lines of soft light. "We can fit them into hulls a third the size of anything the Voss Dominion flies, which means our ships will be faster, more maneuverable, and much harder to hit. We traded raw power for speed and precision. It's a different way of fighting than anyone in the Council has seen in centuries." "And if they see it coming?" Nathan asked. "They won't," Laura said, "because we're not going to show them until the moment matters most." Across the galaxy, in a shipyard hidden inside a hollowed asteroid far from any charted trade route, Admiral Grace Bennett walked the length of a construction bay, watching sparks fall from a half-finished hull like slow, beautiful rain. She had commanded human fleets for nearly 15 years, long enough to remember when Earth's ships were little more than converted cargo vessels bolted together with borrowed alien parts and desperate optimism. What she saw now, rising piece by piece in front of her, was something entirely different. The ship was called the Meridian, the first of a new class humanity had never dared to build openly, because building it openly would have required Council approval, and Council approval would have meant years of delay, endless inspections, and almost certain rejection. So Earth had built it quietly instead, funded through channels that no outside auditor could trace back to any single government, staffed by engineers who had been told only as much as they needed to know and trusted to keep the rest to themselves. "She's beautiful," said a young engineer walking beside Grace, a woman named Sophie Turner, who had transferred from the colony program 2 years earlier, after growing tired of watching human settlements get pushed around by older species with better lawyers and bigger fleets. "She's a start," Grace said. "One ship doesn't win anything. We need 40 of these before we can even think about standing toe-to-toe with a Dominion battle group." "We're at 12, Sophie said. 6 more in the next 4 months if the supply lines hold. Grace allowed herself a small, tired smile. 12 ships was nothing compared to the vast fleets the older council species could field without breaking a sweat. But 12 fast, precise, nearly invisible ships, built from technology no one outside this hidden shipyard even knew existed, was not nothing either. It was a beginning. And beginnings, Grace had learned over a long career of disappointments, were the hardest part. Meanwhile, far from any shipyard, in the quiet offices of Earth's diplomatic archive, an analyst named Ryan Cole sat hunched over a decades-old data terminal, cross-referencing thousands of pages of council meeting records that most people considered too boring to ever read closely. Ryan had a talent that made him valuable in ways few people appreciated, a patience for tedious detail that bordered on obsession. For the past 3 years, at Laura Bishop's quiet request, he had been building something the council would never expect from a species they considered too new and too eager to understand how their own system truly worked. He had been finding the cracks. Every trade agreement the council had approved over the past century, every resource allocation, every land claim like the one that had just taken Calder's Reach away from Earth, Ryan had cross-referenced against older records, against private communications leaked or purchased through careful, quiet channels, against contradictions that no single alien species had ever bothered to notice, because no single alien species had ever needed to look that closely. Older powers rarely question a system that has always worked in their favor. What Ryan found, buried across a century of paperwork that most delegates considered achingly dull, was a pattern too consistent to be accidental. Certain older species, the Vos Dominion chief among them, had spent generations quietly rigging council rulings in their own favor, using obscure ancient claims and technical loopholes to strip resources and territory from newer, weaker members, all while presenting themselves as the fair and patient stewards of galactic order. Humanity was not the first species this had happened to, it was simply the most recent, and possibly, if the pattern held, the first one with the patience and the motive to expose it all at once. "You need to see this," Ryan told Laura Bishop during a secure call late one night, his voice tight with the particular excitement of someone who has just found exactly what he was looking for after years of searching. It's not just Calder's Reach. It's not just us. There are at least 6 other species over the past 80 years who lost territory to the Dominion under nearly identical circumstances. Same kind of ancient claim, same timing, right after they made some kind of valuable discovery on the land in question. Laura leaned forward, the blue light of her display reflecting in her eyes. "Can you prove it?" "I can show a pattern," Ryan said. "Proving intent is harder, but if we can get even 2 of those other species to come forward with their own records, the pattern becomes very hard to explain away as coincidence." "Then that's the next step," Laura said, quietly, carefully. "We're not ready to show our hand yet, not with the fleet, and not with this, but when the moment comes, I want every piece of this ready to drop into the Council's lap all at once." Over the following months, humanity's preparations moved forward on every front at once, each piece separate and hidden from the others, so that even if the Council's intelligence services discovered one thread, they would never see the whole pattern. Grace Bennett's shipyard grew from 12 vessels to 20, then to 28, each new ship faster and quieter than the last. Peter Lang's engineering teams solved problems that had stalled human technology for a decade, breakthroughs that would have taken twice as long under normal council oversight, freed now from the endless inspections and approval processes that had always slowed Earth down before. Ryan Cole's quiet research expanded as well, carefully reaching out through trusted intermediaries to representatives of 2 other species who had lost territory to the Dominion in years past, testing the waters to see whether old grievances might be persuaded to resurface at exactly the right moment. And throughout it all, Elena Marsh continued to sit in council sessions, continued to nod politely at rulings that quietly chipped away at what remained of humanity's patience, continued to play the part of the frustrated but ultimately obedient ambassador the council believed her to be. It was, she often thought during those long sessions, the hardest performance of her career, made possible only by the knowledge of everything happening far beneath the surface, out of sight, exactly where it needed to stay. Late one evening, nearly a year after the outburst in the Golden Chamber, Elena received a message on a secure channel from Admiral Bennett, only a handful of words long. 28 ships ready, awaiting your signal. Elena read the message twice, then closed the channel and sat alone in her quarters for a long moment, looking out at the distant stars beyond her window. 28 ships was still far from enough to challenge the full might of the Galactic Council. But it was enough, combined with everything Laura and Ryan had uncovered, to make a statement the Council would not be able to ignore. It was enough to finally test whether patience, so long treated as humanity's only available currency, could finally be traded for something better. She thought of Calder's Reach, of Nathan Ford's crops growing in soil that had once been lifeless, of the families who had lost their new home to a claim that Ryan's research now suggested had likely been fabricated generations earlier for exactly this purpose. She thought of every quiet insult absorbed in that golden chamber, every polite smile she had forced onto her face, while another piece of humanity's future was quietly signed away. The next opportunity, she knew, would not wait for humanity to be ready. It would arrive exactly when the Council least expected it, and when it did, Earth would finally be prepared to answer with more than words. Somewhere beyond the reach of any Council censor, in the hollowed asteroid that housed humanity's secret fleet, Admiral Grace Bennett stood on the bridge of the Meridian, watching new stars scroll past the viewport as her crew ran final systems checks. Behind her, 27 more ships sat quietly docked, engines cold, waiting, not for the Council to notice them, not yet. Waiting only for the word that would finally set them loose. The signal came at 3 in the morning, Earth time, though time meant very little aboard a ship traveling between stars. Admiral Grace Bennett was already awake when it arrived, standing on the bridge of the Meridian, watching the calm dark of open space through the forward viewport. When the message finally appeared on her console, 3 short words from Elena Marsh, she read them once, felt her pulse quicken, and then read them again to be certain. Calder's Reach, now. She turned to her communications officer, a steady young man named Owen Hart who had served with her for 6 years and had never once seen her hesitate. Signal the fleet, she said. All 28 ships. Formation pattern 3. We move in 10 minutes. Word spread through the hidden shipyard like a current running through still water. Engines that had sat cold and quiet for months began to hum awake, one after another, until the entire hollowed asteroid seemed to vibrate with the sound. Sophie Turner, now serving as chief engineer aboard the Meridian, felt the deck shift gently beneath her feet as the great ship began to move, and for the first time in 2 years of secret construction, she allowed herself to believe that everything she had built might actually matter. The journey to Calder's Reach took 11 hours through folded space, a technology humanity had only recently learned to use reliably, thanks in large part to the reverse-engineered technology Peter Lang's teams had spent years perfecting. For most of those 11 hours, the crews of the fleet said very little, each of them alone with their own thoughts about what waited on the other side. When the Meridian and her 27 companion ships finally emerged from folded space, they did not arrive quietly. Grace had insisted on that point during the final planning session weeks earlier. There would be no ambush, no dishonest trick, nothing the Council could later use to paint humanity as the aggressor. The fleet arrived in open formation, clearly visible, clearly identified, broadcasting a single message across every frequency the Council and the Voss Dominion were known to monitor. The message was Elena Marsh's voice, recorded days earlier, calm and steady, carrying none of the anger she had shown in the Golden Chamber a year before. This time, her tone was something colder and far more dangerous. Certainty. This is Ambassador Elena Marsh, speaking on behalf of the government and people of Earth. 1 year ago, this council awarded the system of Calder's Reach to the Voss Dominion, despite 9 years of lawful human settlement and development. We formally request, one final time, that this ruling be reversed and that Voss Dominion forces withdraw from the system within 24 hours. Should that request be refused, humanity will act to reclaim what is rightfully ours. This is not a declaration of war. It is a declaration that humanity's patience has ended. Aboard the lead Voss Dominion cruiser stationed at Calder's Reach, A commander named Saren received the message with open disbelief. He had spent his entire career among a species that rarely acted without months of careful deliberation and council approval. The idea that the humans, so recently humiliated in the very chamber where this system had been awarded to his people, would arrive with an actual fleet, openly, boldly, without so much as a formal declaration filed through proper channels, struck him as almost laughable. He laughed, in fact, when his censor officer first reported the incoming ships. He stopped laughing when the same officer reported their number, their formation, and the strange, unfamiliar energy signatures radiating from their hulls. "Confirm their identity," Saren ordered, leaning forward in his command chair. "Confirmed, sir. Human vessels, 28 of them. We have no record of ship designs matching these configurations." Saren's confidence wavered for the first time. The Voss Dominion had grown accustomed, over generations, to treating humanity's fleet as a minor curiosity, capable ships for their age, but nowhere near a match for a proper battle group. The vessels now appearing on his sensors did not match anything in that comfortable assumption. "Signal Council Command," Saren said. "Inform them the humans have arrived with an armed fleet at Calder's Reach and are demanding our immediate withdrawal." The message reached the council chamber within minutes, thrown up onto every delegate's display in the middle of an unrelated session on trade regulation. The golden dome, which had been glowing its usual calm amber, flared suddenly into a sharp, urgent red, a color the chamber had not displayed in decades. Speaker Vorin Kahl rose immediately, his 4 eyes wide with something that looked remarkably like fear beneath his usual composed exterior. "This session is suspended. All delegates, remain in the chamber. We require an emergency briefing." Threll, the Voss Dominion delegate, stood so quickly that his chair nearly toppled behind him. "This is unacceptable. Earth cannot simply arrive with warships and issue demands. This is an act of open aggression." According to the recording, Ambassador Marsh characterized it as a final request, not a declaration of war, Vorin said, his voice tight. "Whether the Council, or the Dominion, chooses to treat it as aggression will determine what happens next." Across the chamber, delegates from a dozen species began speaking rapidly among themselves, some in alarm, some in open curiosity, a few, quietly and carefully, in something that almost resembled satisfaction. Not every species in that room had fond memories of the Voss Dominion's long history of quiet resource claims. Some had simply never had the strength, or the fleet, to say so out loud. Back at Calder's Reach, Saren received no immediate orders to withdraw. Dominion protocol required formal council authorization before any territorial concession, and no such authorization could be granted quickly enough to meet the human ultimatum's deadline. Left without clear instructions and unwilling to appear weak in front of a species he still considered beneath his own, Saren made the decision that would define the next several hours of galactic history. "Move to intercept formation," he ordered. "We will not be bullied by a fleet of hastily built human ships. Hold position and prepare defensive systems. If they attempt to enter the system, we respond with proportional force." What Saren did not know, what none of his censor officers had been able to fully analyze in the short time available, was that the human ships approaching his position were not built for the kind of engagement his forces had trained for. Dominion warships were built around massive shield generators and heavy, slow-moving weapons platforms, a doctrine that had served them well for centuries against opponents who fought the same way. Grace Bennett's fleet had been built around an entirely different philosophy: speed, precision, and the ability to disable rather than destroy. When the two fleets finally came within engagement range near the outer edge of the Calder's Reach system, Grace stood calmly at the center of the Meridian's bridge, watching the tactical display with the focus of someone who had run this exact scenario in simulation more times than she could count. "They're holding a defensive line," her tactical officer reported. "Heavy shields forward, weapons charged but not yet firing." "They're waiting to see if we blink," Grace said quietly. "We're not going to blink. Signal the fleet. Execute pattern Delta. Target their engine arrays and shield generators only. No hull breaches unless absolutely necessary. We are not here to destroy them. We are here to make them leave." The order went out across all 28 ships simultaneously, and the human fleet moved in a way the Voss Dominion had never encountered before, splitting into small, fast-moving groups that darted between the slower Dominion cruisers, weapons fire aimed with careful precision at engine cores and shield emitters rather than at the ships themselves. It was a strange kind of engagement, more like a coordinated dance than a traditional battle, human pilots weaving between enemy fire with a speed and agility that Dominion targeting systems, built for a very different kind of opponent, struggled to track. Within the first 20 minutes, 3 Dominion cruisers found their shields collapsing entirely, their engines disabled by precise, repeated strikes that left the ships intact but utterly helpless, drifting silently in the dark. Seren watched in mounting disbelief as his once confident battle line began to fracture, ship after ship reporting critical system failures without a single hull breach among them. "They're not trying to destroy us," his sensor officer said, an edge of confusion in his voice. "They're disabling us. Every strike is targeted, precise." Seren understood, with a sinking feeling, exactly what that meant. The humans could have caused far greater damage if they had chosen to. They were choosing not to, and that restraint was, in its own strange way, more unsettling than open aggression would have been. It meant this was not a desperate, reckless attack. It was a demonstration, carefully controlled, designed to prove a point rather than start a war that could spiral beyond anyone's control. 2 hours after the engagement began, with more than half his fleet disabled and no reinforcements able to arrive in time, Seren made the only decision left available to him. He opened a channel to the Meridian, his voice tight with barely controlled anger and something that might have been grudging respect. "This is Commander Seren of the Voss Dominion fleet. We are prepared to withdraw from the Calder's Reach system, pending formal review by the Galactic Council." Grace Bennett's response was calm, almost gentle, in a way that somehow made the moment feel even more decisive than a triumphant declaration would have. "Acknowledged, Commander. We'll hold position while your ships make repairs and depart. No further engagement is necessary." Aboard the Meridian, a quiet cheer rose briefly among the bridge crew before Grace raised a hand, and the room settled back into disciplined silence. There would be time to celebrate later. For now, there was still a fleet of damaged Dominion ships limping out of the system, and a council chamber back home that had just watched, in real time, as their long-held assumptions about humanity's place in the galaxy fell apart. The footage from the engagement reached council space within hours, relayed through Dominion sensor logs that had been automatically transmitted before Seren could even consider suppressing them. Delegates across the chamber watched, many for the first time, as sleek, unfamiliar human ships outmaneuvered a full Dominion battle group without inflicting a single confirmed loss of life. In the Golden Chamber, the mood had shifted entirely from the confident amusement Elena Marsh had grown used to over 20 years. Now the room buzzed with something closer to uncertainty, delegates from smaller species exchanging glances that carried a question none of them dared to ask aloud. If Earth had been hiding this kind of capability for years, quietly building while the Council dismissed them as harmless, what else had the Council failed to notice? Speaker Vorenkahl called for an emergency session, his 4 eyes fixed on the empty human delegation bench, still vacant, waiting for Elena Marsh to arrive and explain exactly what had just happened, and exactly what humanity intended to do next. Far above Calder's Reach, as the last damaged Dominion cruiser folded out of the system, Admiral Grace Bennett finally allowed herself a long, steady breath. Sophie Turner appeared at her side, her expression somewhere between disbelief and quiet pride. "We did it," Sophie said. "We actually did it." "We proved a point," Grace corrected gently. "The hard part isn't over, it's just beginning." She looked out at the reclaimed system beyond the viewport, at the pale world where Nathan Ford's crops still grew in soil humanity had spent 9 years bringing back to life. Now we have to make sure the Council understands exactly what it means. Behind her, the fleet held formation, quiet and watchful, 28 ships standing guard over a small, hard-won piece of Earth's future, while far away, in a chamber built from shifting crystal light, the entire galaxy braced itself for whatever humanity intended to say next. Elena Marsh arrived at the council chamber 3 days later, and this time she did not wait to be called forward. She walked to the center of the floor, before the session had even formally begun, and the golden dome above her, still faintly touched with the red it had worn since the news from Calder's Reach arrived, seemed to hold its breath, along with every delegate in the room. She was not alone. Beside her walked Ryan Cole, carrying a single data tablet that held 3 years of quiet, patient research, and Laura Bishop, whose calm expression gave no hint of the exhaustion she had felt every day since the outburst in this very chamber had set everything in motion. Speaker Vorenkal watched them approach with visible caution. "Ambassador Marsh, the Council has many questions about the events at Calder's Reach. I'm here to answer them," Elena said, "and to raise a few questions of my own." Threll rose from the Voss Dominion bench, his composure clearly strained beneath a thin layer of practiced calm. What happened at Calder's Reach was an act of unprovoked military aggression against a lawful territorial claim. Earth attacked a Dominion fleet without formal Council authorization. Earth issued a public ultimatum, broadcast openly across every monitored frequency, giving your forces a full day to withdraw peacefully, Elena said. Your commander chose to hold position and prepare for conflict, rather than seek Council guidance. We disabled your ships without a single loss of life on either side, and the moment your commander requested withdrawal, we allowed it without further engagement. If that is aggression, I would ask this Council to consider what word it might use to describe what your species did to mine 1 year ago, in this very room. A murmur moved through the chamber. Voren raised a hand for quiet, though his 4 eyes remained fixed on Elena, with a wariness he had never shown her before. The Council granted that ruling, based on documented historical claim, Ambassador. Whatever your objections, the process was lawful. Was it? Elena asked. She nodded to Ryan, who stepped forward and activated the tablet in his hands. Above the center of the chamber floor, a vast display bloomed to life, rows of documents, dates, and cross-referenced records stretching back nearly a century, visible to every delegate in the room at once. For the past 3 years, at my request, this analyst has reviewed Council territorial rulings going back 80 years, Elena said. What he found is a pattern that I believe this Council has never fully examined, because no one ever had reason to look closely enough. 6 separate instances, across 6 different newer member species, in which a valuable resource discovery on a lawfully settled world was followed, within a short window of time, by the sudden emergence of an ancient territorial claim filed by the Voss Dominion. In every case, the claim was approved. In every case, the original settlers lost their world. The display shifted, showing side-by-side comparisons, dates lining up with uncomfortable precision, resource surveys filed only weeks before ancient claims mysteriously surfaced to override them. Threll's silver face had gone rigid. These are old records, taken out of context. Ancient claims are a legitimate part of Council law, recognized for centuries. They are, Elena agreed, which is exactly why they make such a useful tool, for a species patient enough and old enough to know precisely which claims to hold in reserve, and precisely when to use them. She turned slowly, addressing the wider chamber now, rather than Threll directly. I am not asking this Council to believe me, simply because I say so. I am asking you to look at your own records, which my analyst has now made available to every delegation in this room. Draw your own conclusions. A tense silence settled over the chamber as delegates began quietly accessing the shared files on their own displays, murmurs rising here and there as different species found their own history reflected uncomfortably in Ryan's research. In the back of the chamber, a small, quiet delegate from a modest agricultural world called Yulen, a species that had lost a resource-rich moon to a nearly identical Dominion claim 40 years earlier, rose slowly to speak for the first time in longer than most delegates could remember. We filed a formal protest 40 years ago, when this happened to us, the Yulen delegate said, her voice thin but steady. We were told our claim lacked sufficient documentation. We were told the matter was closed. We believed we were simply unlucky. She looked toward the display still hovering above the chamber floor. We were not unlucky, we were chosen. More voices began to rise, tentative at first, then gathering confidence as delegate after delegate found their own species reflected somewhere in the pattern Ryan had uncovered. Not every grievance matched perfectly. Not every species had been targeted by the Dominion alone. A few names appeared linked to other older powers as well, but the shape of it, the long, patient, quiet manipulation of a system built to appear fair, while consistently favoring the oldest and most established members, was impossible to ignore once it had been laid out so clearly in front of the entire chamber at once. Speaker Voren Kahl sat very still through much of this, his expression unreadable, though Elena noticed his hands tighten slightly against the arms of his seat. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight she had never heard from him before. If what has been presented here today is accurate, Voren said slowly, then this council has failed in its most basic duty, not once, but repeatedly, across generations. I will not pretend that is a comfortable thing to consider. No one is asking you to be comfortable, Elena said. We are asking you to be honest. Threll, sensing the room shifting away from him, attempted one final argument. Even if some historical claims deserve review, that does not excuse Earth's decision to bypass council process entirely and resolve the matter through force. We resolved it through force because your fleet chose not to withdraw when given the chance to do so peacefully, Elena said. But you're right, that force cannot be the answer every time, which is why I am not here today only to accuse. I am here to propose a solution. She paused, letting the chamber settle into full attention. Effective immediately, we request that all territorial claims older than 50 years be subject to independent review by a panel drawn from species outside the claim in question, rather than approved through the current process, which allows older, more established powers to quietly influence outcomes in their own favor. We request that Calder's Reach be formally and permanently returned to Earth, and we request that the Voss Dominion's standing seat on the Council's ruling committee be suspended, pending a full investigation into the pattern presented here today. The chamber erupted into overlapping voices, some outraged, some clearly relieved to finally hear someone say aloud what many had quietly suspected for years but lacked the standing, or the courage, to raise themselves. Threll attempted to argue further, but found fewer and fewer delegates willing to meet his eyes, the momentum of the room shifting visibly away from him with every passing minute. It took nearly 6 hours of continued debate, argument, and careful negotiation, much of it led quietly behind the scenes by Laura Bishop, who moved between delegations offering evidence, answering questions, and gently reminding smaller species that their own grievances, so long ignored, finally had a real chance of being heard. By the end of that long session, the Council voted, by a wide and unexpected margin, to approve every one of Elena's requests. Calder's Reach was returned to Earth, formally and permanently. The review process for ancient territorial claims was overhauled, effective immediately, and the Voss Dominion's seat on the ruling committee was suspended, its influence over council decisions curtailed for the first time in longer than most delegates in the room could remember. Threll left the chamber that evening without speaking to anyone, his usual composed bearing replaced by something tighter and more guarded. Elena watched him go, feeling no particular satisfaction in his defeat, only a quiet, steady sense that something long overdue had finally begun to shift. Outside the chamber, in the wide crystal corridor that led back toward the human embassy wing, Elena found herself surrounded by delegates from species she had barely spoken to in 20 years of quiet, careful diplomacy. The Yulin delegate approached first, offering a small, formal bow of gratitude. Others followed, some simply nodding respectfully, others pausing to ask quiet questions about how their own old grievances might now be reconsidered under the new review process. General Cross found her eventually, standing near the edge of the crowd with an expression that mixed pride with something more thoughtful. You didn't just win Calder's Reach back, he said quietly, once they were finally alone. You just gave half this council a reason to trust us for the first time. Trust is going to take longer to build than one session, Elena said, but it's a start. She looked back toward the golden dome, glowing now with a soft, steady white light, a color the chamber rarely displayed, one that Elena had only ever seen described in old records as the color the room turned when a genuinely difficult truth had finally been acknowledged. For 20 years I believed patience was the only tool we had. I was wrong. It was never patience they respected. It was proof. We simply needed enough of it, all at once, to be impossible to ignore. Behind her, the chamber slowly emptied, delegates dispersing to their own quarters to consider everything they had witnessed that day, while far above, in the quiet dark beyond the Council's orbital platform, the human fleet that had made this moment possible held steady, patient, and watchful, ready for whatever came next. 6 months after the vote that returned Calder's reach to Earth, the Galactic Council chamber looked almost unrecognizable to anyone who had sat through its sessions in years past. The Golden Dome, once a symbol of an old order that rarely questioned itself, now cycled more often between calm blue and steady white, colors the ancient chamber reserved for genuine deliberation rather than quiet, comfortable agreement among long-established powers. Elena Marsh stood at the podium, no longer the tense, careful ambassador who had once rehearsed every sentence twice before speaking. She addressed the chamber now with the ease of someone who had earned her place at the table, not through patience alone, but through proof that could no longer be dismissed. The independent review panel has completed its first full year of work, she said, gesturing toward a display that showed a long list of territorial claims, each marked with a small notation indicating its outcome. Of the 43 ancient claims submitted for reconsideration this year, 26 were overturned entirely, returning territory and resources to the species who had originally settled and developed them. 17 were upheld, following genuine and thorough review by delegates with no direct stake in the outcome. Around the chamber, delegates listened with an attentiveness that would have seemed impossible only a year earlier. The Yulen delegate, whose lost moon had finally been returned to her people 3 months earlier, sat near the front now, no longer relegated to the quiet, overlooked benches at the back of the room. The changes had not come easily, and they had not come without resistance. The Vos Dominion, stripped of its seat on the ruling committee and facing a lengthy investigation into decades of quiet manipulation, had spent months attempting to rally support among the Council's remaining older powers, arguing that the new review process threatened the stability of a system that had, in their words, kept the peace for centuries. For a time, it had seemed possible that enough of the old guard might band together to reverse the reforms entirely, restoring the comfortable order that had favored them for so long. That effort collapsed the day Ryan Cole's research, expanded now with the help of investigators from 3 other species eager to see the full pattern exposed, revealed evidence that the Dominion had not acted alone. 2 other ancient powers, species that had sat quietly through Elena's original accusations, without ever suspecting their own records might eventually be examined just as closely, were found to have engaged in similar patterns of manipulation, though on a smaller scale. Faced with the prospect of a council-wide investigation reaching into their own histories, those species quietly withdrew their support for the Dominion's attempted resistance, choosing instead to negotiate their own quiet settlements before the full evidence became public. Threll had resigned from his position not long after, replaced by a younger Dominion representative named Kale, who arrived at the council with a markedly different tone, one of cautious cooperation rather than quiet superiority. Elena had been surprised, during their first meeting, to find something almost like relief in the younger delegate's manner, as if he too had grown weary of defending a system he privately understood to be unfair. "My predecessor believed the old ways would last forever," Kale told her once, during a quiet conversation in the embassy corridor. "I think perhaps he was simply afraid of what might happen if they didn't." Earth's own standing within the Council had shifted just as dramatically. What had once been a probationary membership, endlessly delayed and endlessly conditional, was formally upgraded within the year to full and permanent status, complete with a seat on the very ruling committee that had once dismissed humanity's concerns without a second thought. Elena Marsh herself was nominated, by a coalition of smaller species grateful for her role in exposing the old system's flaws, to serve as one of the committee's rotating chairs, a position no human had ever been offered before. She accepted the nomination with a mixture of pride and quiet unease, aware that the responsibility now resting on her shoulders was far greater than the simple act of defending Earth's interests in a single chamber. She was, in some sense, now responsible for helping to build something fairer for every species that had ever been quietly overlooked by the old order, a task far larger than anything she had imagined when she first stepped into this chamber as a nervous young ambassador 2 decades earlier. Back on Earth, and across the human colonies scattered throughout their small but growing corner of the galaxy, the changes rippled outward in ways that touched ordinary lives, far removed from the marble floors of the council chamber. On Calder's Reach, Nathan Ford stood at the edge of a field that stretched further than it ever had before, watching a new group of settlers step off a transport ship, families who had waited years for a chance to build a life on the world he had spent nearly a decade bringing back from lifeless dust. "Feels different this time," Nathan said to Sophie Turner, who had traveled out to the colony for a brief visit between engineering assignments. "Like it's actually going to stay ours." "It is," Sophie said. "That's the whole point of everything we built, not just to win one fight, to make sure we never have to fight the same one twice." Admiral Grace Bennett's fleet, no longer hidden away in a secret shipyard, carved from a hollow asteroid, now operated openly as part of humanity's official defense forces, its ships still built around the same principles of speed and precision that had proven so effective at Calder's Reach, but no longer treated as a closely guarded secret. Other species, intrigued by what humanity had accomplished, had even begun quiet discussions about technology sharing agreements, a level of respect and cooperation that would have seemed unthinkable only 2 years earlier. Laura Bishop, who had spent so many long nights coordinating the quiet work that made everything possible, finally allowed herself something she had denied herself for years, a genuine vacation, spent not analyzing star charts or cross-referencing old council records, but simply sitting on a quiet beach on Earth, watching ordinary waves roll across an ordinary shore, grateful for a peace she had worked so hard and so quietly to help build. Late one evening, nearly 2 years after the outburst that had started everything, Elena Marsh stood alone at the tall window of her private quarters in the Council's diplomatic wing, looking out over the same view of distant alien starships she had once found so intimidating. They no longer seemed quite so overwhelming now, not because they had changed, but because Earth's place among them finally felt secure, earned rather than granted, as a quiet favor from powers who could take it away whenever they pleased. General Cross found her there, as he often did during these late hours, and stood quietly beside her for a long moment before speaking. "Any regrets?" he asked, "about how it all started? One outburst in a crowded chamber, and here we are." Elena considered the question carefully before answering, the way she considered most things now. "No regrets," she said finally. "Just relief that it finally happened. We spent 20 years believing patience alone would eventually earn us a fair place at that table. It never would have, not without something to back it up. And now? Now we hold that place because we earned it, and because enough other species finally had the courage to admit the old system was never as fair as it claimed to be." She looked out at the stars a moment longer, thinking of Calder's Reach, of the Yulin delegate's returned moon, of every quiet grievance that had finally found its way into the light, after decades of being dismissed as unlucky coincidence rather than deliberate design. Patience has its place, but it should never be the only tool a people has to survive. Behind her, the golden chamber sat quiet and dark for the night, waiting for tomorrow's session, ready to continue the slow, difficult work of building something genuinely fairer than what had come before. It would not be perfect. Old habits and older grudges did not disappear overnight, and Elena knew there would be difficult sessions ahead, disagreements yet to come, and cautious allies who might still, someday, need convincing all over again. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, Elena Marsh walked away from that chamber without the familiar, exhausting weight of quiet frustration pressing against her chest. Humanity had stopped waiting to be heard, and in doing so, had finally given the rest of the galaxy a reason to listen. Far below, on a world once thought lost forever, Nathan Ford watched the sun set behind fields of green that stretched all the way to the horizon, and allowed himself, at last, to believe that this time, it truly was theirs to keep.